Hello, good morning. So I'm just going to wait a few more minutes for more people to join class. Hope you're all doing well. So we'll start in 5 minutes and I'll discuss the article. It is another article written by Shireen Razak, and this article looks at the murder of Neil Stonechild, and it was a really controversial case in Saskatoon. And I'll discuss it in relation to policing. There's also an NFB film about the Stonechild case, and we won't have time to watch it all, but it's in the PowerPoint slides, and so you can watch it if you have time. So I'll discuss the article and then the test, and I'll try to leave time at the end for a discussion as well, because during the first class there was not that much time for discussion. It would be nice to hear what you have to say about the reading and the topics, and if you have any questions, and you can also use the time to speak to each other, and we can use the chat function as well if you don't want to speak orally. So every week the lectures will be recorded through this Blackboard system, and on Friday I will download the recordings and send them to you in case you cannot attend. So the class is both synchronous and asynchronous, but it's really early in the morning in Alberta, so I know that it might be difficult for someone to attend so early every week. So I will send you recordings on Friday in case you miss the synchronous lecture. And the readings have also been sent to everyone, and they're posted on Blackboard. But every week I will also send you the reading for the next week. So on Fridays, then I will send you a message with the lecture slides and the reading for next week. Hopefully that will be efficient. There are lots of different ways to use Blackboard, so I'm still trying to figure out the most efficient way to use it so that you have access to everything. Hopefully it's okay. So the article this week discusses the case of Neil Stonechild. Neil Stonechild was a Saulteaux First Nations teenager who died of hypothermia shortly after he was picked up by the Saskatoon Police Service. There were accusations that the police took him to the northwest section of Saskatoon and abandoned him in a field on a night when the temperature was below minus 28 degrees Celsius. The practice was referred to as a starlight tour, and a number of these cases in Saskatoon have been referred to collectively as the Saskatoon freezing deaths. So this was a routine police procedure where the Saskatoon police were known to pick up First Nations teenagers like Neil Stonechild and leave them to freeze to death in very harsh temperatures. So Shireen Razak writes of these cases, and again, as I discussed in the last class, Shireen Razak has written a book called Race, Space, and the Law, and Razak is interested in the ways that space is about identity making. So the spaces that we are thought to occupy, the neighborhoods that people live in or can afford to live in, um, one's capacity to become a citizen of a country are all really identity making. And in this article, Shireen Razak discusses the ways that uh, the Canadian landscape becomes a way of actually enacting harm against Indigenous teenagers through the freezing deaths that are enacted by the police. There can be no more quintessential Canadian death than a freezing death. A country that makes icons of its field of ice and snow, and whose citizens are daily reminded in the national anthem that they are the true north, strong and free, should not be able to take lightly such deaths. That is, to regard them as inevitable. 17-year-old Neil Stonechild, whose body was found in a field in the northwest section of the city of Saskatoon on November 29, 1990, died with strange marks on his wrists and face. Viewing his body for burial, his family wondered if someone had broken his nose, and his older brother, who had been arrested himself, thought the marks on his brother's wrists looked like handcuff marks. His death was not seriously investigated until a decade later, in 2000, when the RCMP, investigating the deaths of two Aboriginal men found in similar circumstances, Rodney Nastis and Lawrence Wegner, and the third man, Daryl Knight, who survived after being dropped off by police in the same area of Saskatoon, added Stonechild to the list of suspicious deaths. So the entire case really poses questions about the police and about the capacity for police to kill civilians. If Daryl Knight had not survived in 2000, 10 years after Neil Stonechild was killed, would these deaths have been investigated? There have been a lot of news stories, protests, a lot of public debate regarding policing following the murder of George Floyd in the United States of America. Canada does not have a death penalty, so even if you were accused of murder in Canada, you could not face the death penalty. It's rare that someone would experience such harsh penalties in Canada. So even if you have problems with housing security, anything to do with money or financial debt, it's unlikely that you would go to jail, and there is no death penalty. So the use of this kind of excessive force by police does not really correspond with Canadian law. The details of these cases often involve cases of teenagers, Indigenous teenagers and Indigenous people who are trying to enjoy their lives. So drinking alcohol, playing cards, going to parties, trying to go on dates, trying to have fun with one's family and friends, all somehow lead up to policing. So how does a night that begins with teenagers wanting to enjoy themselves end with Stonechild being put in the back of a Saskatoon Police Service cruiser, bloody and screaming that the police were going to kill him. This kind of case obviously is really chilling, and it speaks to the severity of systemic discrimination against Indigenous peoples by Canada's institutions. So there were more deaths that were similar, and there were more attempts to arguably kill Indigenous people, and specifically young Indigenous men. And so this is what led to a public inquiry, which was called the Right Inquiry, into the Starlight Tours. In 2003, more Aboriginal men were found frozen to death in the same area outside Saskatoon. Another Aboriginal man, Daryl Knight, nearly met a similar fate when Saskatoon police drove and left Knight in the same location. Knight survived and lodged a formal complaint against the SPS, or the Saskatoon Police, which launched an RCMP investigation into the freezing deaths in 2001. In turn, prominent Saskatoon Indigenous lawyer Don Worm lobbied for a public inquiry into Stonechild's disappearance and death. The inquiry began in 2003, and a final report was presented to the public in 2004. These kind of localized crimes are really about Canada, and I mean the geographical distance between Saskatoon and Ottawa is really large, and Canada is a very large country. It's really spread out, and so it is possible that within certain provinces there is no adherence to federal law. So this is a clip about the murder of Neil Stonechild. Sorry, I have to share the screen. Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. Sorry, bear with me for a second. For some reason. It is a really sad case, but it's also really disturbing just from the perspective of Canadian law, because the federal laws in Canada are actually not really severe. If you were to look at Canadian law, Canada has really strong laws protecting every group of people that could possibly that live in Canada, including we have comprehensive laws protecting transgender rights. Canadians have the right to have an abortion. We have comprehensive anti-racism laws, and so this behavior by local police is really disturbing. While there are authors, especially from the readings, that often discuss this case from a theoretical perspective, um, what we could also think about uh, is the disjuncture between localized acts of violence and Canadian law. That, I mean, what one would consider is, I guess, or what one could ask is, why do people in certain parts of Canada or who work for certain institutions feel as though they don't have to uphold federal law or consider federal laws? So I'll discuss the right inquiry, which is the public inquiry that took place regarding these freezing deaths. So Dr. Shireen Razak discusses this kind of process of disposability and the devaluation of Indigenous lives. And there's a common theme from last week's article and this week's article that Razak makes the argument that people are made into non-humans who can be disposed of by state power. And Shireen Razak draws on cultural theorists like Giorgio Agamben, who is interested in the ways that the state can turn individual lives into bare life. And the example that Agamben gives is often the Holocaust or the treatment of refugees, people who could be made stateless without any claim to citizenship. And Razak wants to look at the ways that these kinds of extreme forms of violence against Indigenous peoples by the police also involves the production of stateless people. The dumping of Aboriginal people to the outskirts of the city is a practice born out of the settlers' need to maintain the lines of force of the colonial city. Today, when dumping comes under legal scrutiny, as it did in the inquiry into the death of Neil Stonechild and an inquest into freezing deaths, it is either transformed into a practice of a few bad cops or denied outright. So it's interesting to think about the politics of a city as opposed to a country. And this is also true in cases like the murder of George Floyd in the United States of America. Is it possible for someone to live a long, healthy, happy life of freedom in New York, but to die quite easily in another part of America? And if so, what does this really mean for an entire country and for law? So if it is possible in one city for local police to simply make their own rules in relation to who is and is not entitled to rights, then the existence of then it just then I guess all of the laws that are in place at a federal level can be suspended. And this is not true legally. So if you live, say, in the city of Toronto, you cannot really pass your own rules that do not correspond with federal laws. But what authors find is that in practices of policing, local police and people who are long-term residents of a city often decide to use their local knowledge in order to decide who is or is not deserving of rights. So what remains on legal record, however, are the racial spatial economies of the settler city and its persistent devaluation of Aboriginal life, a devaluation that law both produces and sustains. In the first part of the article, I present ideas about the racial slash spatial economies of the colonial city. And in the second part, I examine the death of Neil Stonechild and the right inquiry which responded to this death. So these kind of economies of race and space in the colonial city are economies that people create through their devaluation of certain lives as opposed to their valuing of other people's lives. And this creation of an economy of human bodies does not correspond to federal law. It is really through processes of discrimination and preferential treatment that are not justified in Canadian law that these economies are created, and that these very basic human rights are not equally applied or distributed to everyone in Saskatoon. So the inquiry into Neil Stonechild's death chose the handcuffs side of the debate. The details implicated the police were hard to ignore. The Honorable David Wright, Commissioner of the inquiry, believed the testimony of Jason Roy, Neil Stonechild's friend, and he saw Neil bloodied and bruised in the back of a police cruiser on the night of November 24, 1990. Justice Wright came to the conclusion that Stonechild had been in the custody of Constables Larry Hartwig and Brad Senger around midnight on November 24th, and that Stonechild died of exposure in the early morning hours of November 25th. While the Commissioner concluded that the 1990 investigation into Stonechild's death was superficial and totally inadequate, and that more senior officers had ignored reports that Stonechild's death was a suspicious one, he did not connect these actions outright to murder or even to racism. Damning as the details were, they did not in the Commissioner's mind indicate an entrenched and systemic devaluing of Aboriginal life among police. They only indicated, as Joyce Green has written, a tense relationship between two communities, Aboriginal and police, who are culturally different. So the use of this language of cultural difference is then used to mask negligence, that one's negligence or actually pathologization or specifically or targeting of an entire group of people, Indigenous people, and specifically young Indigenous people, is then explained through this language of cultural difference. So the use of this language then of two communities that are separated and do not know each other and do not want to know each other is a really tactical use of the language of multiculturalism to justify violence and police brutality. So the police, the Saskatoon police, are really not a community of people. They are people who are paid to do their jobs, and if they do not do their jobs, or they do their jobs so badly that they violate federal laws, then they are not really a community. So the use of multiculturalism to constantly manage all of these obscene forms of negligence and completely unethical ways of making money as the police are really disturbing. And I think The use of language is something I discussed in the previous lecture about Cindy Gladue, that this kind of use of ethnic community language, that we are all part of different communities, and if someone even kills a person, um, then this is a problem of kind of a lack of cross-cultural understanding rather than a problem of uh, systemic discrimination. Um, and rather than being a hate crime against Indigenous peoples. So the judge then recommended that the police be trained in race relations and anger management and suggested ways in which the two communities might better get along, principally through improved liaison and better complaints and investigation procedures. So, freezing deaths are highly controversial when the circumstances surrounding them include evidence of a stunning level of police indifference, incompetence, and duplicity. The Commissioner dealt with the controversy by turning our attention to a framework guaranteed to cleanse public memory of the violence and dehumanization, cultural difference. If the problem is one of culture, then we need not consider racial hierarchy, and we need not consider the relationship between police and Aboriginal peoples as a colonial one. So I think it is interesting to think about why the language of multiculturalism is drawn upon in these cases where there's obvious police negligence or where the police have actually committed hate crimes. Slavoj Žižek discusses the ways that multiculturalism is actually a form of multinational capitalism and a form of neocolonialism. So what Žižek argues is that multiculturalism is essentially a way of ignoring or managing class antagonism. And Slavoj Žižek is a Marxist. And so Zizek argues that this kind of multiculturalism is really a way of selling things. So someone can stand at a distance between all of the different, say, food that is on offer in a city and pick and choose what kind of food they like. But the problem is that this kind of way of doing business does not really address systemic discrimination in the labor force, and it does not address hate crimes. Um, so the kind of cultural sharing is usually just a way of selling products and also trying to recruit economic investment. It does not uh, address crimes against Indigenous people and people of color. The use of alcohol is a really interesting trope in anti-Indigenous cases in the media and by police. Um, Alcohol is not against the law in Canada, but when young Indigenous people or when Indigenous people are thought to be drinking or rumored to be drinking, then stories of degeneracy are used to refer to Indigenous peoples as addicts. This kind of addiction is similar to the use of the term sex worker prostitute in the case of Cindy Gladue over and over again. Just as there are lots of different ways that one can access sex outside of a cisgender, uh, heterosexual, monogamous Christian family, there are many uses of alcohol and other substances in Canada that are really normalized if uh, they're done by certain middle class people. So I would argue from a Marxist perspective that these cases are really, again, about class antagonism. So I think that I discussed sterilization in the last class, that um, there are ongoing class action lawsuits against the Canadian healthcare system, and nurses have been accused of forcibly sterilizing Indigenous women. So these practices, like the twilight sleep, um, where women lost consciousness during childbirth, are similar to the starlight tours. This kind of other language that is being used by people who work in institutions, um, which involves mocking members of the general public or uh, committing crimes against people due to skin color or name, um, is a really troubling uh, form of violence that Shireen Razak discusses um, in detail in her work. And space is again central to how this kind of immorality ends up shaping an entire city and the ways that a city is policed. So uh, Razak is interested in how people can behave in very moral and good ways when they are in certain spaces and at certain times. But if they are on the street and they are not with their family or friends, could they justify enacting hate crimes against Indigenous peoples? And in many ways, trying to unsettle Indigenous people constantly uh, by using the criminal justice system, by impoverishing Indigenous people, is a facet of settler colonialism. So the structural relations of settler colonialism produce and sustain ongoing daily evictions of Aboriginal people from settler life, evictions that are inevitably violent. The colonial city belongs to the settler, and Aboriginal presence in the city inevitably contests settler occupation. So the existence of young Indigenous people in large number in cities like Saskatoon perhaps troubles the original white settler population. Aboriginality unsettles, challenging the settlers' claim to legitimacy by calling into question the colonial state's most enduring fiction that Aboriginal people are a dying race. White settler colonies such as Canada, Australia, and the US all have similar histories of prohibiting Aboriginal peoples from cities and policing involvement to maintain these colonial arrangements. So, who is and is not in the city and part of the city and has rights to access public space, including public space for the purposes of enjoyment, are very political questions in this time period. And Razak cites David Goldberg, whose careful and now iconic consideration of urban locations and race begins to answer this question by charting, quote, how, quote, racisms become institutionally normalized in and through spatial configuration. So what Goldberg argues then is that spatial processes where people can afford to live, what neighborhoods they can afford to live in, if they choose to live in a rural town or suburb, manages racism and normalizes racism by constructing hierarchies in a neighborhood, in a small town. And if one lives in a city, then these hierarchies are really difficult to uphold. Many people who live in a city are used to meeting lots of people who are middle class or who can work and live comfortably. And so when people are racist, they often end up doing damage to an urban economy. The racialized at once a condition marked on the body, skin, and wounds, and an invisibility non-persons cannot occupy the same place as Europeans and the Europeanized. The city belongs to rational men and women, individuals who are owners of themselves. So the marking of the body creates a whole series of invisible privileges and norms that one is used to seeing in a city. And what Marxists would perhaps argue is that the city doesn't belong to rational men and women. It belongs to people who are individual private property owners or will be in the future. So we can also think about this case in relation to masculinity and specifically hegemonic constructions of masculinity. This kind of collective indifference is something that I discussed in previous classes in relation to Judith Butler's writings about grievability and who we can and cannot grieve for. Judith Butler writes a great deal about nonviolence and the ways that practicing nonviolence involves understanding that all lives are grievable lives. In an essay co-written with George Yancey, Judith Butler answers the question, what is wrong with the phrase, all lives matter? And in this essay, Judith Butler argues that this sense of universalism, the sense of sameness and equality has not been actually realized. So while we can theoretically say that all people are deserving of attention and rights and yes, to have a life, when the power balance is so skewed against a group of people, then it makes sense to celebrate their existence and their capacity to survive discrimination. The kinds of hegemonic masculinity that really frame the murder of, Neil Stonechild um, are really obvious. The kind of aggression that the police exhibit is a form of hypermasculinity, and the refusal to really uh, ever take responsibility for these deaths is also, I think, a way of staging a really violent enactment of masculinity in Saskatoon. Judith Butler argues that gender is not innate, that the ways that we use language and our naming of others and ourselves is not inevitable. It is obviously a product of performativity. And Butler is interested in the ways that we don't just exist as gendered subjects. We enact the whole series of performatives, including our use of language and including our appearance, our everyday acts of speech, our ways of walking, our ways of sitting, our ways of talking, are all ways of doing gender. The problem becomes when someone's way of doing gender involves normalizing violence against others. So if one practices hegemonic masculinity and is involved in patriarchy, they are enacting a series of gender performatives that are not necessarily natural or innate. So Judith Butler's work is really groundbreaking, and it changes the field of gender studies forever, because rather than thinking that the sign that one is born under, male or female, is a byproduct of imagined scientific difference. What Judith Butler argues is that an obsession with this one aspect of the human body, gender, is actually a very political choice and decision. So Shireen Razak argues that the removal of people like Neil Stonechild, firstly from Saskatoon, but then from the world, is really an act of purification, and it is similar to processes of purification that exist in other contexts of ethnic cleansing. So Razak then discusses the ways that settler societies must engage in a constant purification of themselves, and they must try to consistently force Indigenous peoples out of spaces and into confinement. So the right inquiry arranges our understanding of Canada's geographies of violence so that we come to see the freezing deaths as the destiny of a people unable to bear the stresses of modern life, the endpoint for those who refuse to be improved. However, the inquest and the inquiry also reveals features of the zone of indistinction. So these kind of rituals are really about trying to build a certain kind of country by removing people from Canada. And they are the most extreme forms of removal. And I would argue that who can and cannot play a role in Canada is a really political decision, and it's also not a decision that someone could make who is following the Canadian law. We don't all get to go to work and decide who is or is not allowed to be in Canada, or who fulfills a whole series of unwritten norms um, regarding class and appearance. So Shireen Razak writes about these cases and others from the perspective of what I would argue is conflict theory. So in the social sciences and the humanities, um, scholars often write about and research conflict theory. And conflict theory involves any kind of theories to gender or race or sexuality, critical race theory. The sense of antagonism between settlers and the Indigenous in Saskatoon is really disturbing. The late author and well-known feminist writer Bell Hooks once wrote that being oppressed means the absence of choices. So Neil Stonechild died as a teenager, and all of the choices that one has as an adult in terms of education, marriage, childbirth, and even living in Canada were taken from him. So I'll play a clip, but before I do, I want to discuss Michel Foucault's writings regarding biopolitics and the relationship between biopolitics and this case. So for Foucault, biopolitics is a way of governing. It is a way that the state intervenes into all of our lives with warnings on cigarette packs, calorie counts on everything that we consume. And this is seen to be good, or it's imagined to be good and for our own interest. The problem is that while the state invests in certain lives, it divests from other lives. So the strategy for the intervention into human life is biopolitics. Biopower works by offering certain techniques in which to construct a strong citizenry and a strong future. And these forms of biopower can involve policing certain people in a city so that in the future uh, there will only be certain citizens who are born as Canadians. So I'm going to share this video. So this is a documentary that the National Film Board released after the murder of Neil Stonechild. And there was a lot of media and a lot of reports that followed, but the kind of underlying anger towards Indigenous peoples perhaps cannot be addressed in wholly rational terms. The fact that Stonechild was young and had friends and went out and could have obviously fallen in love and had his own children is what one would expect. However, nation building often is not about normal or sensible expectations. It is about engaging in really grandiose behavior in order to make the claim that some are full citizens and others are not, irrespective of the law. And there are lots of different forms of nation building like this. The case of Masa Amini got a lot of attention when Masa Amini was a young woman who was killed by the Iranian police. And um, this is again, I would argue, the work of biopolitics, that the state can intervene and try to build a future country in which they would live. However, not everyone would agree, and I would argue that someone who is a civil servant, who is a police officer, cannot change federal laws and obviously cannot murder someone else. So I'll play the clip. I don't know why it's not working. It's done something really strange for some reason. It's weird. I'll try it again. Yes. I'll send the slides and the lectures, the recorded lectures to you on Friday. So for some reason I can't play the clip. So I'll go back to the slides for now. Hopefully you can watch the NFB documentary when you get a chance. It is a full documentary about the Stonechild case. I want to return to the arguments about gender that I think are really interesting. Because what Razak argues is that this devaluation of Indigenous life is really a performance of hegemonic masculinity. And I think from the perspective of gender studies, one can consider why harming young people and women is central to these practices of anti-Indigenous violence. And what Shireen Razak and other feminist scholars have argued is that this kind of repeated ritualistic violence against young Indigenous people and against women follows similar patterns that would exist in cases of domestic violence and child abuse. So the use of colonized people as a feminized other then justifies this kind of violence. So, is there a way that performativity can be challenged? Judith Butler would say yes, that we are not simply passive victims of gender, that we all make choices as to what language to use, as to how we interact with others, as to what we do with our bodies, and what kind of norms we support, what laws we choose to uphold, or what unwritten rules we choose to enforce. That gender is not an act for Butler. It's not as though Judith Butler wouldn't argue that we are all acting like men or acting like women or acting in certain gendered ways, but we mime or imitate the conventions of gender through a series of stylized acts over the course of a life that give the illusion of a seamless gender performance. So using a certain tone of voice that is soft or quiet as opposed to a very loud, aggressive voice is a gendered performative. In this case of the policing of young Indigenous people, what feminist scholars would argue is that hegemonic masculinity is central to the ways that police do their jobs. And this kind of excess of aggression and violence then justifies the construction of groups of people who experience harm. So Judith Butler is interested then in how language does not simply describe reality but constructs reality. And the example that Butler gives in the text Gender Trouble is this example of a child being born. So when a child is born, what Judith Butler states is that the doctor proclaims it's a girl or it's a boy, and this is what used to happen when children were born everywhere. And the problem that Butler has is that the doctor is not simply just describing the existence of reality by emphasizing the importance of gender. The doctor is gendering a child, and this overemphasis on gender then happens at every stage of life, from the time one is born throughout the whole course of one's life. When taken to extremes, gender roles justify a great deal of self-harm and harm of others. So while there is a lot of scholarship about anti-racism, what I would argue is that unless hegemonic masculinity is called into question or challenged, then I think state violence, militarism, violence against Indigenous people and people of color, as well as women and young people, will continue to be normalized. The sense of, or this writing about purification is central to the argument that the author makes this week. And it is again this rationality of biopolitics where the state is invested in certain lives as opposed to others. And this form of governance for Foucault is obviously really problematic. So Foucault, in his writings about biopolitics and in his writings about the prison, discusses the ways that norms and what is imagined to be normal is then conflated with what is imagined to be right and what is imagined to be legal. And Foucault makes the argument that something could be a norm, it could be the average, but it does not necessarily mean it is right or it is legal. So it could be normal in Saskatoon to be a certain type of person. The majority of people whom the police interact with could be non-Indigenous people who are middle class, and specifically white Christian people. This could be the norm, but this does not mean that one has a claim to morality because they occupy or because they embody a norm. This is also true of the law, that it is not against the law to be a minority or to be someone who is perceived of as someone as someone who is normally not seen to be on the street in Saskatoon in certain neighborhoods. So finally, before I open the lecture up for discussion, I think that this idea of alcohol consumption and mental illness is again interesting from the perspective of colonization. That colonization often involves, or colonial discourse constructs the colonized as not having mental capacity. And in the murder of Cindy Gladue, this constant emphasis of a lack of mental capacity in terms of uncontrollable addiction was central to how Bradley Barton was initially acquitted of murdering Cindy Gladue. And there were years of protests and acts of writing that led to subsequent trials, and Bradley Barton was finally found guilty of killing Cindy Gladue. This justification is really about imagining that colonized peoples do not have the mental capacity to make rational choices. So I'll finish then by opening up the discussion. Use the chat function. The article focused on policing, and these issues of policing have been in the media a great deal. Do you think that the police have the right to use force against people in Canada? I mean, in the city of Toronto, there were some high profile cases of police using tasers against people. Yes, I guess there are situations that would depend on the context. Um, do you agree with Razak's arguments? So the last two articles have been written by Shireen Razak, and do you agree with Shireen Razak's arguments regarding racism against Indigenous people? So Shireen Razak makes the argument that these cases that these cases offer evidence that the Canadian state is racist against Indigenous people, and specifically has the police and, in the case of Cindy Gladue, lawyers and judges often have specific anti-Indigenous feelings or sentiments or a bias against Indigenous peoples. Do you think that this is true? Do you believe Shireen Razak's arguments in these articles? Why do you think that there is this anti-Indigenous sentiment? What do you think can explain it over so many years? Like, Neil Stonechild died in 1990, and then even 10 years later, the police were still carrying out these starlight tours. Why do you think that this behavior goes on? Do you think that there are ways that this behavior could change over time? Like, do you think that systemic discrimination could change over generations? Yes. I think a lot of people do. I think it thank you for your comments. Um, I guess the final issue that I think is interesting in this case, in these cases, and it's just from a perspective sociologist because my PhD is in sociology. Do you think that, or I guess I'm trying to phrase it, um, why do you think alcohol is so central in these narratives about young Indigenous people? Do you think that addiction is a serious issue? Like in these cases, especially in the case of Cindy Gladue, but also Neil Stonechild, there is all this kind of almost psychology that is used to kind of imagine that if these people, if Neil Stonechild was, I guess, almost 19 and he wanted to drink alcohol, which I think is not uncommon, but why do you think that there's so much anxiety about um, young Indigenous people drinking or going out or having fun? And then I guess the question is, I think this is what I think makes it difficult when you look at policing and even the treatment of cases like the Cindy Gladue case, is that there are addiction issues that you've mentioned, yes, intergenerational trauma, and it's a serious issue. The problem is, can this issue then be used against Indigenous people to then justify policing? Like, how does one take addiction seriously while also um, being critical of how someone who is labeled as an addict or someone who is labeled as having these problems could then be picked up by police? Yes. Like in the case of Neil Stonechild, the justification even for picking him up was that he was under the influence of alcohol. But alcohol is legally sold in Canada. I mean, the alcohol industry makes the Canadian government so much money. Um, so, how could this be a justification? The problem is with the language of care. Like, what I would argue from looking at the articles and even statistics is that when people try to care for others, they do so um, sometimes with a sense of superiority. And the problem is that this, under the justification of caring for others, you could also police them and end up taking away their basic freedoms. Yes. Do you think that there is a difference between settlers consuming alcohol as opposed to Indigenous peoples? Like, is this issue with alcohol really about class? Like, if you were in Toronto and you went to an expensive cocktail bar, would that be different than if you are a young Indigenous person who is on the street? Like, is it really a matter of class?
Hi, sorry. Is it okay if I turn my mic on to answer your question instead of typing?
Of course.
Okay, I tried like doing the raise your hand option, but I didn't think you saw it. It's just easier for me to explain speaking.
Great.
Um, I I think that there is definitely a huge difference, and I've seen that like within my family specifically. Like I've had family members struggle with um, addiction, specifically alcoholism, and like I come from a white family, and it was a lot more normalized and like not looked down upon in my family, but then my family would actively talk down about Indigenous people and how and them drinking and drinking culture in Indigenous communities. And I think that there's a huge contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is really about, I mean, do you think it's about money? Like if someone was, because there are multiple Indigenous people who are tenured law professors at the University of Toronto, and they live in Toronto and they have suburban homes. And I think that if someone has a certain middle class income, specifically in a big city like Toronto, the way that people spend money and what they do with their disposable income, it doesn't become a matter of public inquiry. Like, if Indigenous peoples were middle class and lived in big cities, would all of these kind of anxieties, or would people just perceive uh, of someone's lifestyle really differently if they had money? Yeah. It is also what Shireen Razak, I think, talks about as being about space. Because if you were in a suburban home and you had a party and invited people to your suburban home, it would not be on the street. And I think a lot of these crimes against Indigenous people that are really horrific and end up even involving murder really do involve the streets. The same was true of Cindy Gladue, who was known to frequent certain um, places in Edmonton that were outdoors, and specifically the discussion that was had in the courts of law about Cindy Gladue being a sex worker were really about her being in certain neighborhoods that were known for places where sex workers and people who sell drugs go. If she had lived in, say, a condominium in Toronto and um, was a sex worker, then I think that the case would have been treated really differently. Do you think that, I guess the alcohol issue is interesting if you look at statistics, that overall um, there is a lot of alcoholism in Canada, but the statistics if you look at high rates of alcoholism among settlers, um, I don't like it's really difficult to make an argument there's one ethnic community or group or even gender where alcoholism is higher. Um, it was once thought that men had higher rates of alcoholism than women, and now that isn't really true in Canada. So, I mean, why is there this focus on Indigenous people? Because if you look at statistics in Toronto, Toronto has like a really, really large settler population, and it's a big urban city, and there are really high rates of alcoholism among everyone. I guess what I would argue, I mean, if you look at the articles, that this desire to purify places and purify cities and even purify a country, I think is a way of trying to enact further genocide against Indigenous peoples. And it is also a really, I think, a really vicious form of class antagonism against the poor. I mean, what I would argue from a Marxist perspective is that if Indigenous peoples overall made more money and had better housing security and better access to jobs and could move into the middle class, then a lot of issues that affect all unemployed people or precariously housed people or poor people would not affect Indigenous peoples. So a lot of the statistics about things that people do when they're poor are the same for every group of people who are unemployed, precariously housed, and poor. Are there any other comments, questions? I think it is a really interesting discussion just to think. I mean, our kind of anxieties or issues with addiction overall as a country, I think, are really Canadian problems. I don't think that any one group of people could really be said to have these problems as opposed to another. It is just that class often determines um, the kind of problems that we publicly see in the media. Yes. Again, I would argue it's class antagonism because if you were to think about the case of Cindy Gladue, I mean, there's so much anxiety about her being engaged in sex work, but there are really high rates of domestic violence as well, even in a family. And cases of sex work or um, stories of women on the street, again, get a lot of attention, but I think that this masks, like, there are cases of gender-based violence and violence against women in suburban homes as well. Thank you very much for participating in the discussion. I know that it can be difficult to use Blackboard at first to have discussions, so thank you for trying to participate. Um, I really appreciate all your comments. I will try to make sure that the video clips will play. I will contact IT services so that on Tuesday I can play the clips because there are really interesting um, news stories and documentaries, and there is a lot of media now that tries to really ethically comment on indigenous issues. Thank you very much for your participation. Thanks. I'm going to end the class because I teach another class after this as well. Thank you. Thanks. Please email me if you have any questions or concerns about the course content or about the assignments. Thank you. Goodbye.